Alright guys, Red here, welcome back to Red's Resort. Before we begin, I'd just like to take a second to give a big thanks to everyone for all their support and comments and subs over the last year, and an extra big thank you to Laura Spence and Nils Gerdes for becoming channel members and Patreons. Thank you all so much for your support guys, it means a lot, and it definitely helps. If you'd also like to support the channel, you'll find all that stuff in the description below. That aside, let's see what we're talking about today. Today we're going to be taking a look at whether or not having joystick controls is something that would be beneficial to you for playing STAR-ZYWM or any flight related game really. As is usually the case, most commanders will start out on mouse and keyboard, and there's actually a lot to be said for mouse and keyboard. In fact, there's quite a few people in the racing and PvP community out there that swear by mouse and keyboard or mouse and stick as the best possible configuration for getting the fastest times and kills. So it's certainly not to be sniffed at. But if you're watching this, the chances are you're curious about investing in one form of flight stick setup or another. And we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each style of setup a bit later. But first we should probably address why you might want a flight stick setup in the first place. Now I can only really talk from my own experience here, and me and a set of flight sticks go quite far back. And I remember being so comfortable and confident on a keyboard that I pretty much dreaded the transition. At some point though, I decided to go in really cheap and bought myself the Thrustmaster T-Flight. It was around £30 at the time. In my defence, this was ages ago and options were fairly limited back then, but it didn't matter. It was instantly the best gaming decision I've ever made, hands down. Me and that thing literally became one. Sure, like anything else, it took some time to get the muscle memory down, and I now had to incorporate this big daft controller into my setup, but it made the experience of flying in games instantly 1,000 times more engaging. Now, I must have had it for about 6 years I think, and it still works to this day, and even though what I use now is far more complex and better built, I can never really shake that first love. It was clunky and plasticky feeling, but to me, it was pure distilled fun. We had good times, me and the old T-Flight, and we definitely set a few star systems to rights along the way. I guess there's not really much that I can say that will be able to communicate the feeling of flying with a stick. It just matches that activity so well that it inherently draws you in. Like seeing your hands in VR perhaps. Something just gets overwritten at the brain level and feels right. It's probably the same for people who play racing games with a steering wheel and pedals. It has a sort of natural intuition to it. And there's another factor as well, coolness. Nothing quite beats pulling a trigger on a joystick to let loose a barrage of death, or anything really, deploying hardpoints, landing gear, headlights, etc. It just has an unavoidable badassery to it, and depending on the action there will be a specific tactile difference between the commands. Your targeting might be on a 4-way hat switch for example, whereas the scanning suite might be controlled by a couple of normal buttons grouped somewhere else. And this adds a level of personal preference to everyone's individual setup. A customization layer that makes it not just a flight stick setup, but your own custom flight stick setup. And this just draws you in deeper again, making you even more invested and comfortable at the same time. Which brings us to the practicality of having a stick setup. If you run keyboard and mouse, there's absolutely no doubt that you have everything you need at your fingertips. And as we've already said, some of the best pilots out there don't seem to be at any disadvantage when competing, and will no doubt have their setup rigged for maximum efficiency. All the binds they need for their playstyle will be close to where their hand rests for example. And that's basically what stick setup does best for us here. Whether with a stick and a throttle or a stick and stick, the way our hands rest on the movement controls automatically gives us instant access to a slew of additional controls. This will vary wildly depending on what setup and brand you choose to invest in, but the idea remains the same. There is a functional reason why you might enjoy flight sticks over mouse and keyboard though. Now you can easily and no doubt will over time map and remember all the commands for your given ship to a keyboard and mouse, don't get me wrong here. But I feel like even that mapping process becomes a little easier and more intuitive when, like we were saying earlier, there's a physical difference between the controls. Say you've got a couple of 4-way hats and some single press buttons. It's easier to segregate a single 4-way hat and say, right, this is all mining controls, and this one is all power triangle, and then be able to control your movement whilst also changing these variables without your hands leaving the controls. Whereas on a keyboard you would likely have to use a shift key to temporarily change the function of the movement keys or move your hand off them to hit other buttons. So for very specific use cases, sure, mouse and keyboard can be brutally accurate, and that's mainly down to the large travel length of the mouse. But for a more meaningful all-round control of most relevant systems, I think it would be hard to argue against the stick setup. Aside from that, there's always going to be a vast difference in accuracy across all the traversable axes as well. In most cases, the majority of people will use their mouse to point the nose of their ship, so that means this will cover pitch and yaw. And like I said before, due to the length of the throw, the accuracy of a mouse is just ridiculous. However, everything else needs to be a digital on-off signal sent from the keyboard, so all other axes basically. Strafe up, down, left, right, both rolls and forward and back. That's a lot of movement controls to just be reduced to on and off. So with a stick, there's a lot more granularity can be achieved across all directions of movement. And not only that, but it can be done simultaneously as well. This comes in handy for a lot of tasks that require extra fine control. In STAR-ZYWM, for example, you can use a speed limiter to reduce movement when you're coming into land. With sticks, however, a lot of the time this isn't as necessary because the length of the input on a given axis is long enough that it almost becomes redundant. Now don't get me wrong, I still use the speed limiter. It's especially handy if you're in a light, fast ship trying to land, and I still use it a lot to set combat speeds etc, because I do tend to get a bit excited. But you get the idea. The main two reasons that I can present for flight sticks are immersion and precision. Okay, so now we've covered that, let's talk about the various setups you can get. The first one is a HOTAS. This means hands on throttle and stick, and this would be perfect for anyone in any flight related game basically. But let's use some specific examples. Let's use Flight Simulator, DCS, STAR-ZYWM and Elite Dangerous. Now in my experience, for DCS and Flight Simulator, HOTAS is going to be the best match for that style of gameplay, and I will throw Elite in there as well, just for now. And the reason for that is your throttle controls your forward movement, and for Elite, your backwards movement also. And in these games there tends to be prolonged stretches of time where it's best to set your speed or thrust to an absolute point. So if I wanted to go full thrust all the way across a star system, or maintain a speed in an aeroplane or jet, I just set the throttle to a certain point, then I don't need to worry about it until I'm near the end of the journey. If this was another stick instead of a throttle, you would be forced to hold it in the forward position all the way from London to Paris, or all the way to a second sun half a light year away in Elite. So, like, hours basically. That's not to say it can't be done, and we'll get to that, but for argument's sake, let's just say that those three games would be more suited to a throttle and stick for now. This then leaves only STAR-ZYWM and hands-on stick and stick. Now the reason this works so well for STAR-ZYWM is that the larger distances in the games are usually points that are jumped between, and during that jump you have no control over the speed of your ship anyway. This has exceptions obviously, like you could be travelling out in the wilderness of a planet between jump points, and during that duration you would have to hold your thrust forward. But generally, travel occurs between jump points and then is only short range to objectives or destinations. In principle then, you're given up the ability to lock in a certain thrust with a throttle for a whole other set of axes that you can likely assign to strafe directions on your left hand. This opens up a lot of freedom of movement and more suits the vectors capable in a spaceship. It also means that this works well for Elite when you're under normal thrust and not super cruising. And there are workarounds to get it to work well, such as setting super cruise speeds to buttons, maybe 0, 25, 75 and 100% on a hat switch for example. The real question about whether you should buy HOTAS or Hosas really lies in what games it is going to be for. STAR-ZYWM does work perfectly fine using HOTAS controls as well. The problem is, if you play Microsoft Flight Simulator or DCS, then you really need the HOTAS to be honest. not just for practical reasons, but you'll get more immersion that way as well. If you're playing a flight simulator and a space game, then you're still kinda screwed and locked to the HOTAS just for the flight sim's sake. If you're playing just space games though, then your options open up for sure. Personally, I'd recommend twin stick for both Elite and STAR-ZYWM. This does mean less control in Elite Super Cruise, but to be honest, it's heavily offset by the ability to manoeuvre in 3D space. And for STAR-ZYWM, it's just perfect. The major downside here is that there are generally less buttons on a stick compared to a throttle, and that if you change your mind in the future and want to try a flight sim, it means adding new hardware. So best to definitely weigh the options carefully. My problem is that I play all of these games, and as you can see over the years, piece by piece, I've added what is essentially everything for the best of both worlds. This has benefits that are obviously not essential, but are definitely welcome nonetheless. For example, in DCS, I have a whole extra set of axes in the left stick that I can use to slew targeting pods and stuff like that. And for Elite, I can switch between long range and short range controls. So Super Cruise on the HOTAS and 3D thrust on the left stick. And obviously, it adds a bunch of extra buttons for things as well. I've also added pedals, and for the flight sims these allow me to yaw just like I would in a helicopter or a plane using my feet. And also we have the toe brakes in them as well, which are pretty handy for navigating runways, etc. Everything else would be bound as you'd expect. However, in STAR-ZYWM and Elite, the axis bindings are slightly different. On the right stick we have pitch, roll and twist to yaw, and on the left stick we have strafe left and right and strafe up and down. Now, a lot of people find that weird, but having a longer throw and therefore more control over the vertical thrust is actually a massive advantage. It means I can nose onto the target easier and with more precision, and it also means I have more control over the second highest thruster range in the game, which is your bottom thrusters. And once you get used to it, it can really change how granular you can be in that up and down movement. It's also great for landing. Plus it feels slightly similar in your brain to how a helicopter collective works, so it was a nice fit for me. I used to have forward and back strafe on these pinky triggers here, until I got the pedals. Now the pedals deal with forward and reverse, and the toes do boost and brake, and if I'm being honest, I really couldn't be happier with how it all works and how it's turned out. So what are the cons to all of this? Well, the most obvious one is cost. And depending how deep you dip in your toe, this can become extravagant very fast. If you want to come in at something affordable, then check out the T16000M HOTAS or the Hosas version of the same stick. But definitely do your research and watch reviews, because I haven't personally tried these out, but I have heard really good things. And they're the next evolution from my old T-Flight, so they should do you proud. In the mid-range there are a lot of products, but I just skip it. I know that's a weird thing to say, but the reviews in the sort of mid-range products are inconsistent and the cost isn't exactly cheap either. So rather than take that gamble, I would hold off, save, and just skip that entire step entirely. Which means your next stop is either VKB or virpil. And there may be more brands out there, but that's who I've heard about the most. And obviously I have personal experience with virpil. But definitely do lots of research for your particular use case. But both virpil and VKB are all very well built, and to be honest I've seen very few, if any, negative feedback on the products. The other problem is space. As you can see, you need a good space to set all this up. There are solutions where things can be mounted to the desk or even the chair, and each little piece will customise things in a way that suits you, and all for a little bit more time and money. So that's definitely something to consider as well. That's all I've got to say on the matter. If you've got any questions, please leave them below and I'll definitely try and give you an answer. If you want to know more about what bindings I'm using, I already did a video about that a while back. Most things are the same. The only differences are the forward and reverse going to the pedals instead of pinky triggers. So I'll link that in the description. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. Remember, like and subscribe. Remember, there's membership stuff. 07.